Good morning to you once again. Thank you so much for being with us here in Morning at NTV. Now, Tuesday's edition is all focused on the East African Community Affairs. And now we're going to be focusing on the rest for the 2022-2027 East African Legislative Assembly MP seats that is gearing up. And of course, as the current term of the East African Legislative Assembly MPs is coming to an end, the rest for the incoming legislators has been geared up 4 months away to the elections. Most recently, in June, you did have the Assembly passing a budget to the tune of $91.7 in terms of handling regional legislative business, and the theme under which it's accelerating economic recovery as well as enhancing productive sectors for improved livelihoods. Now, today, we get to look at the Assembly as it comes to the end of its 5-year term and what that means. Now, you look at back in 2017, the impending issues to promoting regional integration, one of them being security. And to expound on this, we do have Joseph Ochieno, who's the political commentator and also analyst. Good morning to you.
Good morning, and thanks for having me after a very long time.
I know. It's a pleasure to have you back here, Joseph. Now, in regards to the East African Legislative Assembly, looking at the 5 years that are coming to an end, in your spectrum, what do you believe has been achieved by the Council, and then what other promotional regional integrations have happened over the course?
You know, I'm a politician, and I'm also a political activist, but also I'm a political analyst. But like Thabo Mbeki, I am an African. So I am fundamentally a believer in the African Union. But being privileged to be UPC and almost certainly its president soon, I am also completely emotionally attached to the East African community as a unit. Dr. Bote particularly and Julius Nyerere, having been the two guys who worked extremely hard to see the founding of the East African community. At the time, these guys were focused on the holistic purpose of African peoples as one, but two, also recognizing that the breakup of the continent and the region was such that we by and large generally one peoples. So the founding East African community, which is Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania, that composed its headquarters in Arusha, with the demise of these guys, I still ask then, what really was achieved after Idi Amin to date? By and large, it's very difficult to tell. But I can tell you that between the founding of the East African community up to the collapse of the community in 1977, a huge amount had been realized, to the extent that Mr. Museveni was privileged, he should clap for us, you know, to have gone to the University of Dar es Salaam, thanks to the regional integration object of the time, the purposefulness of togetherness of a community, that we were able to successfully educate some of Kenya's best in Makerere. In our primary schools, those days we used to talk about the headquarters of East African harbors and railways in Nairobi, and which one is in Dar es Salaam and which one is in Kampala, how the Sorority Flying Schools came in on board. Today, what would an average Ugandan graduate talk about specific projects by the East African community? Forget about even actually the integration of peoples. So by and large, it's that. So this is a project that has been lost. So I know that your initial questions would have to go around legislation. I think these legislative questions are irrelevant. I note with interest that your earlier guest was discussing the sexual health bill legislations, around which something that around my campaigns and things of which I feel very strongly about. But you realize that these are things that national governments should be focusing on, and Uganda as a state amongst the founding members of the East African community, where are they on some of those key issues we are being discussed? So if we really can't achieve any of these things by and large, holistically, on a national level, what about a community level for which I don't know how many members of the Legislative Assembly you can count? I don't know how many people know the Secretary of the East African community. I don't know how many people know the name of the current Speaker of the Assembly. So it's really a lost cause, in my opinion, and when you talk about nearly $100 million as a budget for this organization, that I genuinely, as Ochieno, an East African integrationist, simply hardly has no clue to date what is going to do, what that money is going to be doing, and what has done thus far. It is very, very sad. And as a spokesperson for the voices of the majority of Ugandans, I take that by the way, as the UPC, we believe we are the voice of the majority of Ugandans when it comes to social issues and broadly human rights issues, and indeed broadly integration issues. I absolutely want to disappoint you that I really don't have much to say on that. But I am hopeful that as this debate takes shape, that as we welcome DRC and as we try and stabilize our relationship with South Sudan, as Kenya goes through a successful multi-party elections to shame Uganda, as Tanzania's president shows that a woman seemingly humble and modest can actually guide and lead this place, this East African region. I hope that the new assembly, whatever their composition, because you and I are not going to stop it, begin to think on the basis of this conversation that when they go to Arusha, they go to speak on behalf of African peoples first, two, on behalf of the peoples of this region, and definitely those who live Kampala via Entebbe, rather expensively to go to Arusha, will be going on to speak to the ordinary people of Tungamo and the ordinary people of Chinoni, who today absolutely have got no links with what I'm saying, and it's a betrayal.
Okay, all right. Now, in regards to the tenure, you get to see that possibly there are gaps that you can identify in terms of the policies, implementation, and development of different strategies that had been laid before this tenure took flight. Now, in regards to those gaps, can you identify some of those gaps that have actually been brought to light?
Honestly, I don't know. I mean, I can't pick one, and I'm being rather stubborn, and stubborn deliberately, because we cannot have you know, Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania are founding members of this community. Right. I cannot today walk, and I'm a neighbor of Kenya in Tororo. I cannot walk across Busia informally. I cannot go and buy what I want in Nairobi and back. I cannot go to Kisumu for a weekend where my Kulu brethren sit over the weekend over in Nyoyo and come back to Uganda. I can't do that. So really, if I can't do that, that tells us it's been much more complicated that an average person from Chinoni cannot necessarily cross and go somewhere to Kilimanjaro for a weekend and back. You know, so if you cannot harmonize basics as taxes, if I cannot go and rent a house in Nairobi without evidence of an extra, then what integration are we talking about since 1963? And if you can't do that, what is DR Congo doing? Joining us to bother us, and I'm putting that bother because they're absolutely welcome. I'm simply saying these are fudged processes. East African integration, East African community, way before perhaps our camera person had not been born, you know, this African community was the organization that the European Economic Community at the time, and this was an authoritative thing from the then British Prime Minister Ted Heath, they bought ideas, you know, from these three African heads, you know, they bought ideas of how to integrate on the basis of what these African guys did. Now, so if they did it at the time, and fast forward today, so for the European Economic Community, you know what they did? When nations come in, extra nations come, what they call convergency, you need to meet particular criteria. You should not be a gunman at the as a head of state to be allowed. You must have gone through a proper democratic process. You must have had tax harmonization. You must have had perhaps your inflation control over a certain period of time. Your economic growth must have gone at a particular level. You might have harmonized domestic legislations, you know, consistent with the regional legislation, be it maybe on education, maybe in health, maybe in reproductive health, for instance, or it may be on something to do with security and human rights. So meaning, therefore, that by the time South Sudan joins the East African community, we are saying that you are coming in as a member of the household because you meet our criteria. You're not coming here and we begin to have conversations about the way you treat your girls and determine to mutilate them as if they're products for show at a local market. That is how it was with those guys who copied from us. What about us today? We do it in a situation in which Tshisekedi is non-president of DR Congo. Do we know the speaker of Congo? Granted, Congo is the biggest community member coming to, except for the roads that we are allegedly building to connect, but for markets. Markets, again, which I ask, what does it do to somebody in EALA? How do they understand this in context? Final point on this, therefore, before we have any of these conversations, we need in future, and I hope political parties, because this is less about Mr. Museveni and his organization, political parties that matter, that claim to be East African, like in this case Uganda People's Congress, there must be internal conversation. Do you know, East African integration of a nation states is a political issue for which it has to go into a political party manifesto. So I would be delighted to meet Mr. Museveni sometimes in 2023 to have conversations about his vision of East Africa, my vision of East Africa. And thankfully, I overheard your guest saying that Mr. Museveni is an East African. Of course, he likes to talk about some of those things. I want to gain evidence from him. So if we're able to do that at the leadership level, then these guys who go to Arusha, you know, sometimes some of them are actually reserved centers for political interest, you know, go there, have at least a second tier of thought on behalf of the East African peoples, because the challenge facing this continent is leadership. And that leadership is one which is conscious political, conscious visionary, but conscious which is one also driven by values. So really, for those of us, me and you, who are privileged to be able to sit in this kind of spaces, we should be able to help think on behalf of our ordinary peoples. So East Africa as an issue is something which is much more emotive than Uganda, much more complicated than Uganda as it was. And yet it is something that we're using as a matter of sweets for people.
All right, you have mentioned Congo more than 3 times so far, and you seem to talk about it or address it from the angle which sounds negative in reference to them joining the East African community. They seem to be bringing in more trouble than they will be adding value to the community. Discuss.
No, I was discussing it. No, as you know, the discuss questions, particularly the A levels, those days when A levels were still very fine. It was basically meant that you're challenging me and provoking me very deliberately. No, absolutely not. I'm actually raising Congo as a simpler example of the challenges facing this African community. And indeed, I fairly brought in South Sudan, which sort of like a settled member. I'm simply trying to say that there was the processes of integration followed by current leaders makes your first questions to me rather challenging to answer. No, of course, as I said, I'm an African, and I'm an African who wants to make sure that there is actually one Africa. But from where we have to go through a process. And the other thing, of course, we can't talk about integrating with Congo, as I said, who speak of parliament. You know, people of Kisoro don't know, you know. And yet you're the same, indeed, and yet you're the same person who's breaking Kisoro to create tribal districts. Now, discuss.
Okay, all right. Now we get to move into the East African budget that was released, about 91.7 million US dollars. Just to go through the theme of it, accelerating economic recovery and enhancing productive sectors for improved livelihood. Now, one of the focal areas you get to look at when it comes to allocation, you get to look at peace and security, private sector development, participation. Let's go one by one. Peace and security.
For what?
For the East African community.
You see, but that's exactly the point I was trying to make. That by the time a nation state is part of East Africa, you know, they meet all the criteria for which there is actually literally an impossibility for any of them to fight. Meaning the security forces will possibly be exchanging shirts and T-shirts and jackets and perhaps ammunitions when they're chasing either terrorists or local thieves rather than anything else. At the moment, Uganda-Rwanda border is neither here nor there. Rwanda-Congo border is, Rwanda-Congo is actually effectively warriors. 2 member states. That is unheard of nations that are integrated. That's why I brought this thing here. So in as long as that's the case, have you heard the position of the East African community, not heads, East African Parliament, for instance, taking a position saying that, look, there's a crisis going on.
So where are we drawing the line on the heads of the East African community meeting and this particular conversation?
You know, that's why I'm saying it's a fighting process. And it's very unfortunate that the new East Africa post the Obotes and post the Nyereres and post the Kenyattas is one that has been headed by people who are pushing self-interest and pushing self-interest rather than the regional cause of East Africa. Maybe that's another way, the way it was putting, meaning they really had no leadership. So if it was that, the organization would have been moving towards interests of the people rather than interests of the leaders. And for that reason, I think that maybe part of the challenges facing us is that we've got individual, stubborn, very powerful individuals driving the cause, but I'm not really sure whether it's for the economic and social and political long-term interests of our grandchildren, but rather about their medium to short-term or perhaps even contemporary interests. So that is one. But number two, I'm not quite sure, and this is my direct challenge to political politicians seeking these spaces from Uganda, that, you know, if you're going to Arusha as a member of the East African Legislative Assembly, what are your values? What do you represent? What are you taking? What are you going to discuss? What is your own position as an individual on matters of East African security, on matters of East African integration, on the matters of East African economic free trade area, on perhaps on the matter of East African single currency, you as an individual. Number two, and most importantly, what is the position of the political party taking you there, of the political party on whose platform you're using to actually get free flights from Entebbe to Arusha, when actually there's hardly any possibility that an average constituent of yours is going to afford to travel to Jinja for a weekend. All
right. So as matters we do have, for example, migration integration is still failing us. We've heard the Minister of East African Community Affairs saying that in the near future they're planning for an East African currency. So if we are failing just by migration, which should be the easiest, then what is the hope of us getting into a space where we do have a one currency for the East African community?
I'll be very honest with you. That will happen in the generation that some of us are trying to rebuild, not the current leaders. The current leaders have, most of them, lived their time. Thankfully for them, they're very lucky. They're in the afternoons of either their lives or their terms. And I'm saying that without prejudice. It's my job, it's our job, to challenge the emerging political leaders to revisit the old East Africa. The old East Africa, actually, before those community things, we actually had the East African shilling. Some of the things happened before, as I said. And you know, I traveled in a beautiful train from Kampala to Nairobi. Fantastic stuff, you know. So all these are possibilities. These things happen. And as I said, I just have no clue how the current leaders could fudge a process that was so designed by our founding parents very easily for them. So no, the East African single currency is a possibility, but it has to be a possibility based on the process. It has to be a possibility with the mandate of the people. It has to be a conversation with the East Africans. Now, I am an African, I'm an East African. I don't know the views of the majority of the people of Bukedi, sub-region bordering Kenya. I don't know, you know. So sensible governments, and Mr. Museveni talks intellectualism. By today, we would expect that before actually these elections take place, there's an opinion poll that is conducted, so that people from rural Nyabushozi to rural Nyamalogo in Tororo have conversations and know what the issues are, and so they're able to help us answer many of these issues. Do we want to have a single East African currency? Very likely, people would be able to say yes. Very likely people will want to be able to have the free trade zones. Very likely people will want to be able to make sure that when they go to Nairobi to buy beautiful necklaces in exchange for our Karamoja decent shoes, that they're not taxed because they're going to the citizens of their people. I understand people like Comrade Ruto, you know, crosses into Uganda on the basis of relationship with the guys of the mountain of Sebei. And I'm not talking politics, that is a fact, but because of some of these other links, as I said, Barack Obama is my brother. When I'm traveling outside Africa, I said, yes, my brother Barack, and I say, you know, we're neighbors from, you know, it's beautiful, feels very good. So this, by and large, if you take it to that level, it's very, very easy. But at the current level in which I think the countries and the peoples of East Africa are held hostage by leaders at the top, average leaders who go to legislate in these assemblies, I am not quite sure.
Okay. All right, let's look at the breakdown of the East African Legislative Budget. In terms of distribution, you get to look at the East African Community Secretariat will be taking $45 million. The East African Legislative Assembly will be getting $15 million. The East African Court of Justice will be taking $3 million. Now, you do have the Inter-University Council of East Africa, and they will pick a share of $10 million. Lake Victoria Basin Commission will be getting $8 million. You do have $2 million that are earmarked for Lake Victoria fisheries organizations, and of course there's the East African Science and Technology Commission in there too, and they will be receiving $1 million. East African Kiswahili Commission has $1 million, and then the Health Research Commission has $1 million. So you get to see the sectors that should be driving change and integration getting less amounts of money than expected, $1 million versus what's going to Secretariat and the community and so on and so forth. So does that speak into accelerating the recovery and also enhancing productivity in those sectors?
You quarreled with me earlier when I was speaking bad about these other issues. That's exactly what I was trying to talk about. No, this is a predominantly boys' club. This is a predominantly boys' club, but it's also a predominantly elites club. I say an elites club that are stealing our money and taking it down there. And they're taking it down there really, really, really to hump an element of a socio-economic class. Okay. It's a shame that the Secretary of the East African Legislative Assembly would take and should take that huge amount of money. It's a shame, actually, that the Legislative Assembly should take that amount of money. When, as I told you, what is it? Your guest here helped them. What your guest said is something that the Health Commission would be able to have to discuss. The civil servants, actually, I have a view. Some of the civil servants in Uganda, in normal times, when they have not come from Chankwanzi politicized, they do rather sensible jobs. They could actually write massive briefing papers for the East African leaders and political leaders to be able to push these things. As I said, you really don't need in many of these things to actually legislate. As I said, legislation existed those days, and as I said, some of these things were implemented in practice. I'm a living, average, young example of this. It worked. All that the many of these things need are political will, direction, and implementation. We don't need those monies. This is, in as long as it is 1 million versus 41, then you know that actually this society, no wonder I'm actually a socialist and a proud socialist, and I think I'm just much more resolved today that I'm an African socialist, and I think that is what is needed for the future going forward.
All right. Still from the most recent meeting in Arusha, you did have the committee actually having further interactions, and with the Council of Ministers, there were other recommendations that came through. One of them is the need for the Council of Ministers to actually finalize on the modalities on alternative sustainable funding mechanisms for the community, and this is to enhance the disbursement of funds and also address the increasing financial challenges that are within the community. So when we hear this word community, are we still talking about the 7 member states, or are we talking about something else?
Or the interests of the citizens of the 7 member states, or the community as an administration of this community, because I want to take you back. That money was really, really bad manners, the amount of money that is actually held in administration. No, but by and large, they're talking about the community. But that's on a more serious note also. Have you ever had in the last 3 years a big headline on NTV that East African Legislative Assembly members voted overwhelmingly to reject the position taken by other member states or by Rwanda in allegedly threatening the security of Congo? Have you ever heard that? No. And if you haven't, then what do they do? So those are really the issues. I am saying the East African community needs to go back to the drawing board. We need to go back to the founding values, founding principles, and indeed, yes, we are now 7. Congo, we love you, and we dance and with you, and we share your goals, and thank you for forgiving us for the plunder of your wealth and being able to allow us to be with one community. In order for us to be able to consolidate this, there's need to be much more increased communication, by the peoples of this region, perhaps people at the secretariats, including ministries for East Africa. There's really need for ministries for East Africa, ministries for East Africa, actually, to communicate slightly more, and maybe to persuade people like yourselves in the media to make sure that we push slightly much more of what goes on in the community purposefully, so that our average citizen is able to hear and know what's going on. But beyond that, I think I'm involved with many young people in universities and colleges, conversation debates, and I don't know how many of them know what's going on around the community. We need to nurture a fresh pot of leaders, fresh pot of intellectuals, and fresh pots of people, particularly when you talk about technology, people who know that Africa is very much at the backyard of information technology and growth going forward. And so if the guys who went to Dar es Salaam in 1979 and the sharp in 69 and the sharp guys in Makere in 1970, if they put themselves at particular corners in households and see how their grandchildren today speak about the region, about the continent, they should really be worried. My problem is some of them are rather too quiet, and I wonder why.
Okay, all right. Of course, so national into East African community, which should ideally then be feeding into the African Union.
Indeed.
Now, across Africa, there are different trade areas that are free, regional, but free trade areas. How do we get to tap into those to actually enhance economy recovery in the East African region?
It's a tricky one. If you can't really trade within the East African community, how are we going to tap maybe SADC? How are we going to? As I said, that's the challenge of Africa. And as I said, I was praying much earlier, very deliberately, that I'm an African like Thabo Mbeki. And one of the other issues also wonder, who is the African leader today on the African continent? Who is that man or woman who again NTV gives a headline that they've given a thought, even if they're a retired leader. I used to write, as you know, for New African magazine. It's not a bad advert here. It's not an advert, and so I used my column to praise then outgoing president of Tanzania, whom I thought was going to be a future replacement to Thabo Mbeki in Thinking Africa. We need those. Mr. Museveni needs to actively consider this. That could be a fantastic job for him after leaving State House. We need an African leader who's able to shout Africa, who's able to shout an Africa idea. Now, in the absence of that, we possibly need an African who, from Makere University, the Ivory Tower, who's able to shout African leadership and thought. But perhaps we also need an African, maybe an African journalist who's as radically thinking as Ngugi wa Thiong'o, for argument's sake, or Wallace Soyinka, to think for us as a continent. We need those people to wake up African youth, so that as the world moves in the direction it's going, we're able to have a conversation in which there is less about SADC, less about ECOWAS, less about East African community, but more about African Union purpose. I was extremely happy when the African Union added the diaspora, meaning as part of the next element of Africa. I was unfortunate enough to then be living in London because it was reluctant. I mean, it was against my will, but I was still there. But as I was doing that, we used to seek to claim back our African diaspora, including in Brazil. So if then our focus that we're going to reclaim the rest of Africa, including Haiti, back onto the mainland continent, and yet today Mother Africa, the African Union, is absolutely quiet on the headaches between Rwanda and Congo, and you're asking me a question that I cannot answer directly, but you know why I'm saying so, because you're absolutely concerned that SADC and East African community, where are we? That I have to go and beg, with absolute respect, the South African High Commission to simply just arrive at Johannesburg. When we lost a government, Idi Amin was given to Uganda, you may not know that, directly as a result of our commitments, our fights against apartheid in South Africa, that many average young South Africans the other day, when they're playing xenophobic stuff, had forgotten actually that the freedom they got was in a way thanks to the Chris Hanneys of this world and bombardments in Lusaka. But directly we contributed those, and many Ugandans died as a result of that for their countries, and that Zimbabwe that went ahead and hosted them. So no, I think these regional integration things, whatever they are, including these economic benefits, are neither here nor there.
Okay.
The most important game in town is political leadership.
Speaking of political leadership,
yes.
Joseph, of course we're going into elections in 4 months' time.
Yes.
115 have registered under NRM to vie for the 6 spots available right now. But the East African Legislative Assembly is not a bureau of employment, especially for job seekers and political failures in the locality.
I didn't say that.
Yes. So in your discussion, why shouldn't we look at it as an employment bureau in this case?
Many of these guys are my colleagues, my friends. I know them by name. But I do Jesus. It's absolutely difficult for me not to agree with you that this, like presidential advisors in Uganda, East Africa, will not get it. This, like RDCs and their deputies, and even some ambassadors these days, are basically employment bureaus. It's very sad that it would be actually the case in the East African Legislative Assembly, and that's why I was actually being very, very, very sick early when I was describing to you the situation in Arusha, that if there is anybody, any organization, any institute in this region that would save Uganda, save Tanzania, save Rwanda, you know, at the broader overview, would be actually the South African Legislative Assembly. And so for that reason, really we should have legislators who go there to legislate based on conviction rather than a dumping ground in Arusha costing us huge amount of dollars every day.
And those are his comments and of course his analysis on the East African Legislative Assembly, what they're up to, the budget and of course the forthcoming elections. We do take a short